Courtney. I'm back here with cards 6 through 10 using the Simon Says Stamp June 2019 card kit. So I have two pieces of the pattern paper here, but one of them I am using the solid image or solid side of, and this one I am going to cut apart. So I'm going to cut out this large floral arrangement. I'm going to fussy cut it. You can certainly probably use a scan and cut for it, but I'd rather just fussy cut it. I cut it down to make the fussy cutting a little bit easier. That way I don't have to deal with so much excess paper. Keeping my scissors straight and kind of moving that paper around makes the fussy cutting a little bit easier. I am leaving a small outline or border around the image as I cut. Once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and cut down this green panel here to an A2 size card just to check on my placement to see if there's anything else I need, which I decided I did want a few more flowers. So I decided to cut these two smaller flowers from the same pattern paper here, and I cut these the same way, just being careful to leave a small border. Then arrange these on my card panel once again. I ultimately decided to trim this panel down a little bit more. I just took 1/4 of an inch off of the side and the bottom. Then I am going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiments. So I'm lining up 2 of the sentiments from the stamp set, using my grid mat there to make sure they're straight, popping those onto an acrylic block, and then I will stamp this with Simon Says Stamp black dye ink, which will give a very crisp image. I'm going to stamp that down on the lower right hand corner below where my floral arrangement will be. Then I am going to go ahead and adhere this down to a piece of fun foam. I prefer to use my ATG gun whenever I use fun foam, just making sure the fun foam is cut just a little bit smaller than the panel. And I prefer to put the adhesive on the cardstock rather than the fun foam. I just seem to have better luck with that. So I'm going to go ahead and pop up this green panel onto an A2 size note card, just leaving a small white border on all 4 sides. Then I'm going to just play around with my placement here. For the smaller flowers that'll kind of be tucked underneath this large floral arrangement, they'll be adhered flat, and then I'm going to pop up the larger arrangement. So once I have the placement down, I'll remove that large image and just kind of keep these in place. That way I don't lose my placement on them. Stick them down with some wet glue, and then I popped this large image up with some Scotch foam tape, cutting little teeny tiny pieces to make sure that I get in those small areas to make the mailing of this card a little bit easier. Went ahead and arranged that right directly in that place that we had already planned out, and that is it for card number 1. For card number 2, I'm going to bring out my Misty here, and I'm going to bring out the Hello sentiment from the stamp set. And this card ended up being a complete disaster because I really didn't have too much of a plan. But I'm going to go ahead and arrange. I'm going to start with my panel up on the top corner of my Misty. So a stamp positioner is best for this. I'm going to use a rainbow color or rainbow colors of inks by Simon Says Stamp. Going to start off by stamping that on the bottom portion of my card panel. Move that down a little bit and kind of get my placement right. It ended up being 3/4 of an inch. Seemed to be perfect, and I'm just using the little measurements there on the side of my Misty. Then going to move on to the next color, stamp that down, and then move my card panel down again onto 3/4 of an inch and go on to the next color, just making sure that my stamp is clean and dry each and every time I move on to the next color. I don't want any water smudges. I am going to show you all of this stamping just so that you can see the colors of inks that I used, but I am going to speed it up naturally a little bit because I'm pretty much doing the same thing. I will also link all of the colors that I used, as well as all of the rest of the supplies that I used for all of the cards today, in the description box below. Now here I'm getting towards the bottom part of my Misty here. So for the red, or for the last time I had to stamp this, the paper was hanging off the bottom of the Misty. I didn't seem to have an issue. The paper didn't crease or anything, so I was fine with it. I did let this dry for a few minutes just so that my colors didn't blend. Dye inks tend to blend even when you don't want them to. So I did let this sit for just a few minutes, and then I am going to reposition this stamp. And I first started by positioning it on the top one and then had to reposition it because I'm supposed to start on the bottom. And all I did was line this up perfectly over the image that I had already stamped, and then moved it slightly off to the right hand side and slightly up. So the first image that we stamped with the colored ink will basically be a shadow. So once I had the position right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the black dye ink by Simon and stamp that down, move that down 3/4 of an inch, just like I did before, and just keep repeating that with the same black dye ink throughout the entire panel. And then I'll have a shadow for each one of these sentiments in rainbow color, if you guys can even see that on camera. So here's where the card started to go a little crazy. I was going to add a strip to the side and trimmed off the right hand side of this panel, then realized that's probably not going to work. So I ended up bringing in a border die, and this is a border die from Mama Elephant, and ran that through my die cutting machine and ended up not liking that at all. It just didn't go with the sentiment. It's more pretty, and this card is not pretty, if that makes sense to you guys. So I ended up ditching that, and I ended up trimming down the panel on both sides. So basically all I had is a strip of these sentiments. Then I had to kind of think because I had absolutely no plan for this whatsoever. So what I ended up doing is I ended up creating a background, I guess you could kind of say, with little strips of paper. So I brought out a piece of black cardstock that's cut down to a slightly smaller than an A2 card, and I ended up layering this right there in the center, and then I'm going to use little strips of paper on either side. So I'm going to bring out a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is also cut down to an A2 size card. And I'm going to bring out my tonic paper trimmer and cut down little tiny strips. And I'm just using the grid or the measurements on my paper trimmer to make sure that each of these strips are exactly the same size and they're all 1/8 of an inch. And I cut enough to put one on either side for each color of the rainbow. Next, I'm going to bring out my Copic markers. And all I'm basically doing is picking random colors that pretty much match the ink colors that I used. I don't have these in here. I honestly don't remember which ones I chose. I just kind of chose one that somewhat matched. And I'm going to color in these strips. Now, you can certainly use the ink that we used for the background, but I didn't feel like making that much of a mess. So I continued just coloring all of these strips to match the inks at the best that I could. Then we're going to go ahead and assemble the card. So I'm going to first start by adhering this strip of my sentiments down onto this black cardstock right there in the center. And I'm using my grid mat to kind of guide me as far as where the center is. Going to use wet glue. This will give me a couple of seconds to reposition it if I need to. I did bring out a T-square ruler just to make sure that it was completely straight. And then I'm going to start adhering my little strips down. And again, going to use the wet glue. It's just easier for me, but you can use any adhesive here. Going to start off with my red, and I'm going to tuck that right directly next to this sentiment strip or the strip in the center, then move on to the orange and all the way down to all the colors of the rainbow, making sure they're tucked in or directly next to the one next to it or the one that I laid down first, just making sure that I don't have any gaps basically. So once I got the one side done, I will go ahead and do the same exact thing for the other side, just going in that same rainbow order, making sure that each of the strips are right next to one another. And the wet glue does give you a couple of seconds to make sure that you do have the placement correct. Once all of my strips were laid down, I'm going to go ahead and trim down my panel to make sure that everything is flush. And I just took a little bit off the top and bottom, and then took a little bit off the one side because I obviously did not have that sentiment strip in the center centered, because you can clearly see I have a little bit more space on the left hand side than I do the right. So I'm going to go ahead and adhere this down to an A2 size note card. That way I have a little bit of a border on all four sides, and that was it. Not exactly what I had planned out, not that I really had a concrete plan, but it is what it is. It's very bright and cheery. Next, moving on to the third card, going to bring out my Misty again and taking these individual leaf stamps as well as this little flower, and I'm going to stamp this twice because I wasn't sure how many I was going to need. Going to bring out my blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. Going to stamp this twice just so that I have a bold black outline for each one of my images. Then I will flip around my card panel 180 degrees and restamp these twice again. Just makes the stamping a little bit easier and kind of makes it go by a little bit faster, I guess. Once those were stamped out, we're going to move on to the Copic coloring, and we're going to be using multiple colors or color families for each of these images. So I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which is the YG17, just for the base of the leaves and creating a shadow where one leaf is behind the other. Move on to the YG13 and just extend that out a little bit further. Then the YG01, and then I'm going to finish off with a Y11. So we're going to go from yellow greens to yellow. Going to color all of these leaves the same way with the same color combination, then moving on to the next set of leaves, again going in with my darkest color, well, what was going to be my darkest color, then blending that out with the G00, and then finishing off with the BG10. The G00 and the BG10 will blend well together because they both end in 0. Realized that I wasn't getting all that much contrast here, so I ended up bringing in the G07 and just adding a little tiny flick on the base of each of these leaves and then blending that out. And then for the rest of them, I did stick to that 4 color combination. For the next set of leaves, I am going to do the same thing, starting off with my darkest color just on the base of the leaves and also creating a shadow. Moving on to the darkest mid-tone, then that G00 again, and this time I'm bringing in a B00 for the tip of the leaves, so I'll have a little bit more of a blue, and then I did have to go back in with that G00 just to make sure that those two colors blended a little bit better. For the flowers, I am going to switch over to some R80 markers. For this flower, I'm going to start off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas and to get the paper a little bit saturated. This will make my blending a little bit easier. Going on to the darkest color, which is the R89, and just adding the very darkest areas. So basically on the base of each of the petals, and also where one petal is laying behind another. The petals in the middle of the little flower are going to be a little bit darker in general than the petals up front, just because they're not going to have as much of a highlight. Blending those areas out with the R85, just extending those out and extending those flicks out a little bit further. Then the R83, doing the same thing, extending those out and just leaving the very tips of the leaf or the tips of the petals for that R81, which is that color that we had started out with. So once all of my coloring was done, I went ahead and cut these out, and I do not have the matching dies, which I don't even think they have yet. So I just used my scan and cut because I just didn't feel like fussy cutting. And next we're going to go ahead and create the background. So I'm taking a piece of Nina Solar Weight 80-pound cardstock, and this is an A2 size card size. And then I am going to do a little bit of ink blending with Aged Mahogany Distress ink. Using my blending brush, and I'm just putting a tiny bit of color down. It's barely noticeable. I'm using my scrap piece of paper there to kind of take off most of the ink from the blending brush before I apply that to my panel. Next, I'm going to take the Waves stencil by Simon Says Stamp just to add a little bit of texture in the background. I like to tape my stencils down with some Post-it note tape just to make sure that they don't move around. And next I'm going to add a little bit more of that aged mahogany directly over that stencil. Now I don't want a lot of texture, I guess, or a lot of pattern in my background. I want to keep it pretty subtle. So I went in very light with the ink. So next I'm going to go ahead and arrange my flowers and leaves here just to kind of get the placement down. Now these leaves, or these sprigs of leaves, or whatever you call them, are pretty long, and these flowers are pretty tiny. So what I ended up doing, so that it didn't look too crazy, I ended up trimming down the leaves, and I just took the base part of them off. These are going to be tucked behind my flowers anyway, so I'm not too concerned. And I'll place down everything that I want the way I want it. And the flowers are going to be popped up. So I am going to leave those on top. And once I have all of those leaves placed down the way I want them, I'll go ahead and remove the flowers very carefully, making sure that I don't move around the leaves. And then just kind of lift up the tips of the leaves, place down 1 or 2 dots of my wet glue. I use the Tombow Mono Multi Glue because it dries pretty quickly. And that way I don't lose the placement. I have them in the exact way that I had them originally, and there's no guessing about where I had them and where they need to be. Once I had all of my leaves placed down, I'm going to go ahead and take a few little pieces of Scotch foam tape for both of my flowers and pop those right in the center of my little arrangement there. And next, for the sentiment, I'm going to go ahead and bring out that sending word again, and going to go ahead and stamp that out with that same black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. And then we'll create a sentiment strip for the remaining part of the sentiment. And here's where I got ink all over my fingers. I just used my stamp chamois and it seemed to come right off. So no issues there. For my sentiment strip, I'm going to bring out a piece of black cardstock, and I'm going to cut 2 strips. One will be for my card panel itself, and one will be for my sentiment strip. For my sentiment strip one, I am going to treat that with my anti-static tool first, then stamp my sentiment out with Versamark ink, sprinkle on some Hero Arts maybe white embossing powder, and then I will go ahead and heat set that. Next, we'll go ahead and assemble the card. So I'm using a top folding A2 size note card for this one. Going to go ahead and adhere my card panel flat down off to the right hand side of the card base here. Again, using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to give me a couple of seconds to reposition it if needed. And then I'm going to glue on that second strip that we created, or that we cut down with that black cardstock. And this hangs off a little bit, but I'll trim that down. But I do want to give it a minute or two to let that glue completely dry. For the sentiment strip, I cut at an angle on one side and straight on the other, and I'll pop that up with some Scotch foam tape and then trim off that remaining piece, or that leftover piece of that black cardstock that's kind of hanging off the left-hand side of my card. And I do have a little smudge right above my little arrangement there. And I don't know whether you guys can see it, but in order to cover that up, I'm going to bring out some Cloud 9 Dream Drops by Nuvo and just place a few of those around my little arrangement there. I used the backing of a piece of Scotch foam tape for my scrap paper to make sure that there was no air bubbles before adding that to my card. So for my next, I guess, project, because this is not a card, I'm using one of the envelopes that come in the kit, and I'm using the white one. Going to bring out some Distress Oxide inks here and going to do some ink blending right onto my envelope. Using Cracked Pistachio, Twisted Citron, and Lucky Clover. I couldn't think of that one. So I'm going to start off just by kind of laying out some color, not really getting a good blend here, and I'm not really too concerned about getting a good blend at first. I kind of just get the paper saturated, kind of like I do with the Copics. It makes the blending a little bit easier the more ink you have down. Once I add that darker color, that Lucky Clover, I don't add any more of that. So I start with my lightest colors, add a little bit of that dark, and then I'll worry about or concentrate on blending all of these colors together now. The Twisted Citron is super bright, so I'm going to kind of tone that down with the Cracked Pistachio a little bit, just by going over the same areas more than once. So basically going over where that Lucky Clover is with the Cracked Pistachio and extending that right until I hit that Twisted Citron area to kind of tone that down so it's not so bright. So once I was happy with the blending that I got from these three colors, I went ahead and put this aside to air dry. You can use your heat tool. I prefer to let everything air dry. So I let this dry for maybe about 20 minutes or so. We're going to be doing some heat embossing. So before I do that, I wanted to test to make sure that my ink was completely dry, just by sprinkling on some of that embossing powder. If it didn't stick, then I'm good to go. I'm going to bring out my Misty and arrange this large frame here onto my envelope, treat that with my anti-static tool, stamp this out with a Versamark ink, and then we'll sprinkle on that same embossing powder that I just can't stop embossing lately. White embossing. I don't know why. I'm kind of hooked to it. So once I do that, I am going to go ahead and make sure that my heat gun is completely heated up before bringing this to an envelope. This is not cardstock, so it's a lot thinner. I don't want to apply too much heat all in one area. So you'll see that as I'm heating this up, I'm kind of moving my heat gun away and bringing it to the paper just for a second or two, and then moving that away to kind of avoid as much warping as I possibly can. I know it's just an envelope, but it's not meant to be heat embossed, I guess. So once that's done, we're going to go ahead and bring out some clean water, a paintbrush, and I have a paper towel here. And I'm just painting on water, basically, in these embossed areas. I let the water sit there for a couple of seconds and then dab that up with a paper towel. Now, the longer you keep the water on there, the more ink it's going to take up. I don't want to take up all the ink. I just want it to be a little bit more toned down, I guess, from the rest of the background. So there are certain areas that I may have gone back to if I didn't take up enough ink. But for the most part, I was pretty happy with the results. I want it to be a little bit more subtle. This is just an envelope. But I figured this will be a cute way to address an envelope. It's the perfect size to fit somebody's address right inside. And of course, the stamp set will match any of the cards that we made yesterday and today. So I went ahead and went around the entire image just with that clean water and that paper towel, and that is it. It dried pretty quickly. I didn't have any issues with warping, and that is, I can't really say card number 4, but project number 4. And next we're going to move on to card number 5. So I'm using a piece of the Nina Desert Storm cardstock that comes in the kit, and this is cut down to 5 by 3 3/4. Going to arrange my round frame here onto my card panel. And I'm going to be using Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, but in all honesty, you could probably use any ink here. And then I'm going to bring out my white colored pencil, and I use the Polychromos, but you can use any colored pencils here, but I'm only going to be using the white, making sure that my pencil has a really sharp tip. I'm basically going to be adding shading where my darkest areas will be with more pressure. So I'm only using the white pencil here. So I'm adding more pressure where the shadow areas would be of each of the images. And then I'm going to kind of let up on the pressure as I go to what would normally be the lightest areas, if that makes sense. So I'm creating shadows still where one petal is laying behind another petal, but instead of it being a darker color, it's going to be just a more vibrant white. So I'm going to cover up all of these images, every part of it, but it depends on the amount of pressure that I put with the pencil. So I'm starting off with a really heavy hand and then kind of working my way up to the top of the petal with more of a light hand. So it's kind of going to be a little bit of a gradient. where you are using a very light hand, a little bit of that cardstock, that Nina Desert Storm, will show through, but I'm good with that. I'm going to add my shading basically the same way as I did for all of the other images that we colored yesterday and today, but it's just kind of opposite. It's going to be a white shadow instead of a color shadow. So I went ahead and colored in this entire image, or all of the images within this stamp, the same way, just using different amounts of pressure with just that white pencil. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring back out my Misty, and I kept my stamp in there. I did not move my stamp. I'm going to go ahead and treat this with my anti-static tool, and big surprise, we're going to bring out the white embossing powder once again. Going to go ahead and heat set that. I think I mentioned it already, but I use the Hero Arts white embossing powder. Make sure that your heat gun is heated up as much as possible. Before bringing that to the card panel, I did still have some warping because I did actually heat set this panel twice. Once this was heat set, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with my sentiment, also from the same stamp set. Going to retreat the panel with my anti-static tool because I've probably left fingerprints that I probably just can't see. Going to stamp that with the Versamark ink, use the same embossing powder, heat set that, making sure the heat gun is set up. You guys know the drill by now. We're on card number 5. So once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and take a white panel of Nina Solar White, cut this down to a 5 1/4 by 4, which is just a little bit bigger than my panel and a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. Now I did have some warping, so I did have to add some pressure to this when I'm adhering everything together, just because I had some corners and some sides kind of coming up because of it being warped. But if you add enough pressure for a couple of seconds, you should be fine. Going to adhere this to another, or the card base is actually Nina Desert Storm as well. And then that is it. No, actually, I added some shimmer with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to just all of the images within that stamp. This will change the color just a teeny tiny bit, but it will make it stand out a little bit. But that is it for card number 5. Here is a quick look at all 5 cards that we created today. Thanks so much, guys, for stopping by. Have a great day. Bye.